Chapter 8 of Ruth Fielding at the War Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ruth Fielding at the War Front by Alice B. Emerson. The Chocolate Peddler. There was the flash of a lamp ahead. "Here we are!" cried Charlie Bragg, in a tone of relief, bringing the car to a rocking stop. Ruth Fielding could see but little as she looked out from under the hood of the ambulance, yet she imagined there was a ridge of land behind the compound at the entrance to which they had halted. Charlie got out and helped her down. A second man appeared in the gateway of the stockade beside the sentinel. The girl approached with the ambulance driver, who said, "Here she is, Doc, and a load of stuff she says you'll need. This is Miss Fielding, and she's a regular good fellow. Dr. Monteith, Miss Fielding." "I'm glad to see you," the surgeon said warmly, taking the bag from Ruth and seizing her cold hand in his warm clasp. "We are very busy here, very short of supplies. Our stores were utterly destroyed when—" He did not finish his statement, but ushered her into the compound. There were a few twinkling lights. She saw that there were a number of huts within this enclosure, each being, of course, a ward. They left Charlie Bragg and an orderly to remove the supplies from the ambulance, while the surgeon took Ruth to the hut that was to be her own. On the way they passed a crushed and shapeless mass that might once, the girl thought, have been another hut. "Is that—" she asked, pointing. "Yes, the shell dropped squarely on it. We got her out from under the wreckage after putting out the fire. She was killed instantly," said the surgeon. "You were not frightened, Miss Fielding?" "Why, yes," she said gravely. "I have, however, been frightened before. We have had night air raids at Clare, but as Charlie Bragg says, I've not been killed yet." "That is the way to look at it," he said cheerfully. "It's the only way. Back in all our minds is the expectation of sudden death, I suppose, only if it is sudden. That is what we pray for, if it is to come." "I know," Ruth said softly, "but let us keep from thinking of it." "Who is this lady?" she asked a moment later. "Ah," said the gentlemanly surgeon, seeing the figure in the doorway of the new supply hut. "It is our matron, Miss Strang, a lovely lady. I will leave you to her kindness." He introduced the girl to the elderly woman, who examined Ruth with frank curiosity as she entered the hut. "You are a real American, I presume?" the woman said, smiling. "I hope so. Not to be frightened by what has happened here already?" "We expect such sad happenings, do we not?" "Yes, we must. But this was a terrible thing. They say," the matron observed, "that it was the result of treachery." "Oh, you do not mean—" "They say a man has sold a map of this whole sector to the Boches. A man! Faugh! There are such creatures in all armies. Perhaps there are more among our forces than we know of. They say many of foreign blood among the expeditionary forces are secretly against the war, and are friends of the enemy." "I cannot believe that," cried Ruth. "We are becoming tainted with the fears of the French, because they have found so many spies." "We will find just as many, perhaps," said Mrs. Strang bitterly. "France is a republic, and the United States is a republic. Does freedom breed traitors, I wonder?" "I guess," said Ruth gently, "that we may have been too kind to certain classes of immigrants to the United States, unused to liberty that they spell it License. "There are people other than ignorant foreigners who must be watched in these awful times," the matron said bitterly. "There are teachers in our colleges who sneer at patriotism, just as they sneer at religion. Whisper, Miss Fielding. I am told that the very man they suspect in this dreadful thing, the American who has sold the map of this sector to the Germans, came from one of our foremost colleges, and is an American, bred and born." Ruth could not speak in answer to this. Her heart throbbed painfully in her throat. To so accuse Tom Cameron of heartless and dastardly treachery! She could not defend him. To defend was to accuse. If everybody believed this awful thing— Ruth was just as sure of Tom Cameron's guiltlessness as she was of her own faithfulness. But how damning the circumstantial evidence must be against him! She was thankful she heard nothing more of this thing that night. Charlie and other men brought in the supplies. She could not arrange them then, for she was exhausted. She only waited to lock the door when all the supplies were placed, and then found the hut where the women of the Red Cross slept. She had here a narrow cot, a locker, and a chair, and the privacy of a movable screen. Nothing else. This was real soldiering, as she soon found. Her experience at Lee's and at Clare had been nothing like this. In one town she lived at a pension, while at the latter hospital she had had her own little cell in the annex. However, the girl of the Red Mill never thought of complaining. If these other earnest girls and women could stand such rough experiences, why not she? She slept and dreamed of home, of the Red Mill and Uncle Jabez and Aunt Elvira Boggs, with her murmured, "Oh, my back and oh, my bones." She was again a child and roamed the woods and fields along the Lumano River with Tom Cameron and Helen. "I wish I were at home. I wish I were at home," was her waking thought. It was the first time she had whispered that wish since leaving the States, but never before had her heart been so sore and her spirit so depressed. When some weeks before she had believed Tom Cameron seriously wounded, she had been frightened and anxious only. Now the whole world seemed to have gone wrong. There was nobody with whom she could confer about this awful trouble. She arose, and after making her toilet, and before breakfast, went out of the hut. She beheld an entirely different-looking landscape from that which she was used to about Clare. Through the gateway of the compound she saw a rutted road, with dun fields beyond. Behind, the ridge rose abruptly between the hospital and the battle front. A red-headed young Irishman in khaki stood at the gateway, or tramped up and down with his rifle on his shoulder. He could not look at the girl without grinning, and Ruth smiled in return. "'Tis a broth of a morning, miss," he whispered, as she drew near. "Be you the new lady Charlie Bragg brought over last night?" "Yes, I am, to take the place of the girl who... She faltered and could not go on. The Irish lad nodded and blinked rapidly. "Bedad," he muttered, "we'll make the Boches pay for that when we go over the top. Never fear." He halted abruptly, became preternaturally grave, and presented arms. The young surgeon, Dr. Monteith, who had met Ruth the night before, tramped in from a morning walk. "Good morning, Miss Fielding. Did you sleep?" She confessed that she did. He smiled, but there was a deep crease between his eyes. "I am glad you are up betimes. We need some of your supplies. Can I send the orderlies with the schedule soon?" "Oh, yes, I will try to be ready in half an hour," she cried, turning quickly toward the hut, of which she carried the key. "Wait, wait," he called. "No such hurry as all that. You have not breakfasted, I imagine? Well, never neglect your food. It is vital. I shall not send to you until 8:30. He saluted and went on. Ruth went to the hut in which the nurses messed. The night shift had just come in, and she found them a pleasant, if serious, lot of women, and of all nationalities by blood, truly American. There was an air about the nurses in the field hospital different from those she had met in institutions farther back from the battle line. There were serious girls there, but there was always a spatter of irresponsibles as well. Here the nurses were like soldiers, and soldiers in active and dangerous duty. There was a marked reserve about them, and an expression of countenance that reminded Ruth of some of the nuns she had seen at home, a serenity that seemed to announce that they had given over worldly thoughts, and that their minds were fixed upon higher things. There was a hushed way of speaking, too, that impressed Ruth. Was as though they listened all the time for something. Was it for the whine of the shells that sometimes came over the ridge and dropped perilously near the hospital? As the day went on, however, the girl found that there was considerably more cheerfulness and light-heartedness in and about the hospital than she supposed would be found here. Having straightened up her own hut and supplied the various wards with what they needed for the day, she went about, getting acquainted. It was a large hospital, and there were many huts, In each of these shelters were from 24 to 40 patients. A nurse and an orderly took care of each hut, with a night attendant. Everybody was busy. There were many visitors, too. Visitors of all kinds and for all imaginary reasons. People came in automobiles. These had passes from military authorities to see and bring comforts to the wounded. And there were more modest visitors who came on foot and brought baskets of jams and jellies and cakes and homemade luxuries that were eagerly welcomed by the wounded. For soldiers everywhere, whether well or ill, develop a sweet tooth. Into the compound, about mid-afternoon, Ruth saw a tall figure slouch with a basket on his arm. It had begun to drizzle, as it so often does during the winter in northern France, and this man wore a bedrabbled cloak, a brigandish-looking cloak, over his blue smock. She had never seen such a figure before, and yet there was something about the man that seemed familiar to the keen-eyed girl. "Who is he?" she asked a nurse standing with her at the door of a ward, and pointing to the man slouching along with his basket across the open way. "Oh, that? It is Nico, the chocolate peddler," said the nurse carelessly. "A harmless fellow, not quite right. Here," and she tapped her own forehead significantly. "You understand? They say he lived here when first the Boches used their nasty gas, and he was caught in a cellar where a gas bomb exploded, and it affected his brain. It does that sometimes, you know," she added sadly. Ruth's eyes had followed the chocolate seller intently. Around a corner of a hut swung the surgeon, who was already the girl's friend. He all but ran against the slouching figure, and he spoke sharply to the man. For an instant the chocolate peddler straightened. He stood, indeed, in a very soldierly fashion. Then, as the quick-tempered surgeon strode on, Nico bowed. He bowed from the hips, and Ruth gasped as she saw the obeisance. Only yesterday she had seen a man bow in the same way. End of chapter 8.